welcome to the 6th episode of the MD Edge Post Call podcast. In this episode, I welcome Craig Getting and Luis Montalva. Craig is a director at the Lantern Theater Company in Philadelphia, and Luis is a medical student at Thomas Jefferson University. TJU recently partnered with the Lantern Company and Craig Getting to launch a theater class for medical professionals. They learn acting and writing and staging. The stage has become a way to deal with stress, access new parts of your brain, and even develop patient communication skills. So here now, from the basement of the Lantern Theater Company in Center City, Philadelphia, part 1 of my conversation with Craig and Luis.
English drama double major, because I was into, reading and literature and writing in high school. Mm-hmm. And got into, went to my middle of nowhere, Ohio college and got cast in a bunch of shows my freshman year to the point where I was like, I don't know if I'm going to declare my English major.
Right. Okay.
Because I'm so busy and I'm doing all this other stuff and it seems to be working pretty well. And my mom came out to see me in a show and I was like, I don't think I'm going to be an English major. And she's like, that's fine. Which is like, it's not like I was dropping my track to a law degree. Like she was already the expectations, I think.
She's like, English or drama. Like,
you had the expectations pretty low.
Yeah.
You're like, hey, don't, there's not going to be a lot of fancy gifts at Christmas for a while.
Yeah, correct.
That's great. Yeah, that's hilarious. I
do ask that question all the time, though. Yeah. Why am I don't know.
Well, and what I found as like because you're going to have a career where you're going to make no money, essentially slave labor, and then bam, $500,000.
Dude, it's nuts. Yeah. You're going from like, I don't know, like 50, 60, and I don't know, like you're doing the work the attendees are doing, but then once you just have finished that, like it goes to like 200 plus. I mean, like,
it's crazy. So like if you go by hour, residents and fellows make about a third of minimum wage per hour. And then fellows make about half, and then you get out, bam. And then if you go into academia and you start doing like writing papers and doing research, it's even crazier.
Yeah.
But it's literal, like the best metaphor for it that I found is indentured servitude from the early days. Right?
Yeah.
Give us your life, and then we'll see. And if you make it,
if you get a stake through, keep your mental, keep your nuts, and like keep your.
I guess without doing an introduction, we'll just go right into it. Because I'll edit it up and it'll be what it needs to be. But like I guess. So being a doctor and being in the arts are similar in that you kind of jump and you're like, well, I have to make it or I'm really screwed. Mm-hmm, and I'm going to have to be an Uber driver.
Well, yeah, I mean, when we first started the Empathy Project at Jefferson, like our first year, this is almost 5 years ago now, because I think we're in our 5th year now. And we very quickly like realized the kinship in how artists, theater artists approach their craft, and a lot of artists do. I don't want to just limit it to that, but also folks going into medicine and what it is to be at medical school and the time and the labor intensive, the time intensive schedule, the way that you kind of seclude yourself from other parts of the world. I know so many friends in the theater community who you might not see them for 8 weeks at a time because they're on a show, they're doing a thing, and then you like pull your head up and you're like, all right, who do I still know? Who am I still connected to?
That's great. I've noticed you have to take a big bet on yourself, and then you're around a bunch of other people who are betting on themselves. And
right. Oh my God.
I would imagine that you're all looking at each other like, I'm not scared. Are you scared? We're cool, right?
Yeah. Did you see that, Luis? Do you like as you're meeting people in the first year and?
Oh my God. So. I guess initially, even like they break it down for you and they say, oh no, like we're getting rid of like grades. We're trying, at least for the new curriculum here, they're trying to make it collaborative. Yes, you are going to collaborate, but at the end of the day, like you're still, it's still that sense. And I don't know if it was my class or that we ended up with what you call just the gunners, like a bunch of gunners, and everybody's just going ham. And a lot of people talk about, you're still intimidated for whatever reason. Like you try to like figure out, you try to make it, like you try to say, okay, no, I got this right, I got this down. But like I think there's a lot of things people are still trying to figure it out, and I don't think like the environment, whether like they're trying to make it like as community, as community create a good community for everybody to learn. It's just like, I think it's just the nature of people who are going to like self-selectively go into medicine. It's just it's their craft. They know it's going to be hard. They know they need to like be a top of something just to get to where they need to be. And yeah, like you talk, like I have a lot of artist friends as well, and they're tough. Like they work super hard, and I'm like, there's no difference between like medicine and art in that way. Like if you pick something that you're going to be investing your whole life into, and like essentially it's going to be like your whole life moving forward, even like not just school, you gotta, it's just going to be working hard. And yeah, there's a lot of competition. There's not like that much selection. There's not that many opportunities for what you essentially want to be doing. Yeah, so it's cutthroat, regardless.
I think that there are multiple parallels, because like you notice that everyone around you has the same drive and same intensity, but like you said, they're also like kind of your competition, and you need to beat them, but you can't hate them. It's not like in a football practice where you can go against somebody and beat them. They're like, you have to beat them by working with them.
Right.
Which is a really intense kind of race, I suppose.
Yeah, and in the nonprofit art world, especially here in Philly, in the nonprofit theater world, you're working with you're not necessarily the same. You're working with a lot of the same people regularly. You're building relationships with the folks. But as for actors anyway, not myself, but for the actors in town, they're still going into the same auditions against each other. Yeah. They can, depending on the season, they might see each other at the same couple of auditions, depending on what roles they're good for. And I've talked to people who get into a bit of a crew, depending on the director always calling them in for the same thing. And then the companies themselves, many of whom are kind of small, are also competing for the same audiences, for the same dwindling pool of funding, all those challenges
that's the same in medicine.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, I know. It's the same. And so but it is all in service of this, larger but also very personal calling. So you have to like balance that.
Well, and that's what I was just going to say as well. I think that the third, I suppose, big parallel is that it's what you want to do, and you are driven by the action, not the title that accompanies the action.
Right.
And you get energy and kind of solace as like from your soul, I suppose, from doing the thing that you want to do.
I think that may be like one of the, maybe, I don't know, like the biggest difference between art and medicine, because even in medicine, it's easier to forget that just because of compensation and everything else, the recognition that you get from it, from just holding a certain position or achieving a certain level within it. At some point, it doesn't necessarily like correlate with how well you are as a healer, how well you do as a healer versus just being a doctor.
Right, and I imagine that's a similar thing where like at some point you got to pay the bills, which is, you got to teach, you got to go and give talks, you've got to find a way to make money, which is not the thing you wanted to do, but you've got to do that kind of dirty work, so to speak, in order to do the thing you want to do.
Yeah, I think like a lot of these industries that we're talking about, or fields or whatever they might be, that are like driven by your desire to do the work, whatever the work is. You want to make art, you want to heal people, you want to research new ways to heal people. You then also have to balance that with the realities of whatever industry you're working in. So it's, okay, how do I market myself? Okay, how do I make people know that I'm even doing a show so that they show up and judge me for it, which is very vulnerable? Or how do I, in medicine, it's where am I going to go work? Where do I want to work? Who will have me?
It gets to a point. Yeah, absolutely. I think like for the people who've gotten to a certain like level, like within their own organization, like to be the top, they can pick, essentially say, I want this place. But for the majority of everybody else, it's just like, who's going to have me? Who's going to give me a room to be, like to do this to?
And I think I find it interesting that you derive pleasure from the action. That's something that I've been really focused on. I went to school at Ole Miss, which is where William Faulkner went to school. And he wrote something that really stuck with me, and I've mentioned on this podcast before, which is don't be a writer, be writing.
Right.
Which says, because if I wanted to call myself an actor, you do like a couple things here or there, like, and I'm an actor. Like if you Google it and we're pranced around in your apartment, then you can identify as whatever you want. But you don't want to do that. You don't want to be a doctor. You want to be practicing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I had a directing professor who similarly said, "You're not a director unless you're directing. Like you're not. You can technically hold that title, I guess, or if you've ever done it, right? But the only thing that's going to keep you doing it is if you're driven to keep doing it.
Yeah, that moment at night where you're like, man, I kind of want to do more. Let's do some more stuff. Yeah. So let's talk about being a director then, because we have someone here who I imagine is not going to pursue a career in directing or acting or staging, but here we are learning how to deal with our emotions through pretending to do other stuff.
Sure. So directing is a weird art in theater, and it's different than working in film. But from my experience as a pretty young director, all things considered, so there are probably people even more knowledgeable than me, but what I know about it is that you are working in service of mostly everyone else's impulses, and you are working from a point of instinct and clarity. So your goal, your job is to not only steer the ship, but learn how the ship works. And not try
team management,
not try to make the ship do things it doesn't want to do, but push it and send it in the direction that you think it's supposed to go. So working with an established play, a 400-year-old Shakespeare play, or even something that's canonized, you are usually coming and saying, okay, why do I want to do this play?
Is it relevant now, et cetera?
Is it relevant now? And how can my team best do that? And you go through the casting process, and then it's mostly getting out of their way if you have a really talented team. If you're directing an educational theater, or when I say that, I mostly mean like at a university level or something, that's also a whole teaching process that is a little bit different. But in professional theater, you hopefully have the luxury of saying, okay, I love my team, I respect their instincts, and it's mostly about getting everyone to agree on what the play is, and then setting them up to teach it to the audience every night, because the way that you tell a story to an audience does involve a little bit of teaching when you're doing it in real time over the course of an evening in the theater.
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say a good piece of advice to you. You notice how he took a little credit, but then he gave solace to his older superiors so as to say publicly on the record, I am not you. That would be a good piece of advice for you for a while. I would suggest doing that. Like, I don't know, these data require further confirmation. But I also think it's the thing you said about being instinctual and trusting your team is really important as well. But theater is in a weird spot right now because you have theater fans, but you're competing with VR and Game of Thrones is good. It's really good. But convincing people to do this thing. Well, medicine's going through the same thing. We're like, man, I went to medical school. I probably know more than Dr. Google. I promise. I promise that I can help you out a little bit better. Which, I mean, you would hope so, right? But so talking about directing and kind of getting out of the way of a good team, but also teaching people who need to learn to advance. Do you find yourself as a director, as an artist, or as someone just a connoisseur, learning more about the art form through teaching people who want to be professionals?
Yeah, and I learn about the art form and what it needs today by putting the show up every night and seeing what audiences are responding to, and learning about and thinking through how it's going to be received. And then this gets to a lot of the work that I'm trying to do in the classroom, is like thinking through, okay, what do I think this moment is about? What do I think this scene is about? And then saying, okay, but isn't that going to land with the person in the second row, and the seventh row, and the 10th row? And thinking through whatever I have control over to make that happen. But to your earlier comment about theater being in competition with a lot of other media these days, that's another reason why I think you're seeing projects like ours crop up. It's always been there, and it's at the roots of theater also, but I think there is a growing section of the arts community, especially here in America, that is looking for community-driven work. That doesn't mean community theater as we think of it traditionally, but is how do we make art with our community? That is not, okay, some of it's just a cost thing. Like, not everyone can afford the tickets to come see a play, even in Philly, where it's pretty inexpensive. So how do we make neighbors and community members and certain populations like med students invested in theater making, because we think it has value beyond just coming and seeing it? the making has value.
It's really interesting because I when I first learned about what the fourth wall was when in 7th grade or whatever, and I notice myself now, like, still, even if they're looking at me, like, it's them and it's me, and like there's a distance, but like when you watch sports on your TV and you think, man, today is a good day for a round of golf, that would be fun. I think that for people who might not have tried to get on the stage before getting on the stage gives a whole new perspective of what it's like when you're watching, but it also, I think, possibly drives the desire to watch more and to feel that way. So we're here and we're talking because there is a project by the Lantern Theater Company to help doctors through burnout and just blow off some steam and maybe see the world through a different lens or from a different point on the stage. And for those of you that don't know, I could throw a penny and hit Thomas Jefferson University in comparison to Lantern, and we're in the theater district of Philly. Walnut is right around the corner, and which is like one of the oldest theaters in the continent. And so this is a really big, vibrant scene. But can you talk a little bit about, Craig, about how the program started, and we'll go kick it to our doctor here and see what he has to say.
Oh, sure. So we are in our 5th year of operation over at Jeff right now, which I think means about 7 years ago, Dr. Sal Mangione, who's a professor and practicing doc over at Jeff, who's a big theater buff, big arts buff, and he came to us. He was a fan of our work and came to our artistic director, Charles McMahon, and they had a couple conversations, and he had this idea for bringing an acting and playwriting class to Jefferson. He is very learned and this kind of wonderful, gregarious scholar, and he will talk your ear off about the history of Greek theater as it relates to culture teaching lessons to its citizens.
That's philosophy. That's really intense.
Yes. Well, and the idea that they used to have big theater festivals as a way to process either what you were going to experience when you went off to war or to experience what you were feeling now that you were back.
Tragedy and comedy.
Right.
Interesting.
Or to, metabolize certain elements of their belief system or whatever that you might need to do, and you can live a life in 2 hours on stage that's not your own, right? And hopefully come to some sort of communal catharsis. So Sal is looking for a way to bring something like this to Jefferson because of this perceived empathy deficiency, either through either it being eroded or it not being there in the first place or whatever it might be. Approached us and we talked back and forth for a couple years trying to get funding. We ended up getting 2 years of funding that was matched by the university from the IMAP Macy Foundation. They had a professionalism in medicine grant track that we were able to get. And so for 2 years we were working with 2 groups of about 10 for 10 or 15 folks for a 15 session over the course of a full year. And then since those 2 years were ended, we switched to just through the university, and it's now an 8-week class that happens twice a year. And yeah, it's been fascinating because I think we did the research that we could. There are programs like this out there, or there are also, we were but standing on the shoulders of standardized patient work or other, the work at the Stony Brook Institute, which is the Alan Alda Center, kind of learning how performance has helped doctors train for ages, right? Yeah. But Sal will tell me throughout the entire planning process, his goal was to keep physicians as physicians and not have them, be unable to deal with patients and then go off and be radiologists. Because if you get through that 3rd year and you're like at the bottom in terms of like what you can handle from humanity, and you just want to go be a tech.
Right.
And so he was seeing these really promising students and knowing that it was a larger problem in the medical community, and saying, okay, what can we give these kids who might come in and be wonderful physicians because they are emotionally intelligent, and are ready, they're full of that empathy that you might need. And how can we either kind of inoculate them against that loss or give them an outlet so that they can stick around,
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll just interject with some of my own personal experience. So I mentioned off before we started recording that I am an actor. And I was fortunate enough to do something for money. Like there was a makeup artist, and I sat in a chair and stuff. And what I found was like, why did I wait so long to try this? And I feel like if you are coaching a group of people to give something a try, we can go back to the statement you made earlier, where it's about community. We've got a bunch of people who think, man, I'm having a really weird, tough time, in your 40s or 50s, but I have the skill that I remember, and I know what stage left is, and I know how to remember some lines, and maybe I'll reach out to my community theater director and say, like, hey, I would love to get involved. And I think that's like the grassroots movement that I think you're talking about. But we have a root of grass right in front of us, who's learning how to do it, who's learning how to act and be dramatic. So how's it gone? What have you learned, and are you glad you did it?
Oh, I'm absolutely glad I did it. This, I think, I did it back my first year. That's when we, I guess for my class, that's when we typically do it. And I think like the first thing that I learned and what was most impressive for me is like initially coming in, like you have medical students, they have a ton of other work that it's important that they're going to get tested on. And now you give them like 2 hours and a half or 3 hours that you're going to be spending on your evening, just twice a week, just, all right, we're gonna go play acting, like theater and whatnot. So like a lot of them, like initially, I think those were actually some of the comments. And every time like we will go into the class or like the workshop, it's like, oh, how are we feeling today? And they're like, well, I could rather be doing something else because
I'm freaking out, man.
Yeah.
But I think the very cool thing was, first of all, with Greg, when he talked about just directing it, being a director and just like all those emotions, all the things that we were doing, going through. In the class, he was able to just direct it and, even give permission to say those things, give permission to like laugh at yourself. And even when someone said something that everybody in the room could be like, that's ridiculous to say, he'll be like sometimes like the first one to laugh, but in a way that was not judgmental, but more like giving it permission. Oh, that's actually kind of funny. That's so in just seeing that he was in a position of power that allowed the room itself and the student itself to just forgive themselves a little bit more, forgive themselves. That I think was like the most important thing. And after that, just like I started realizing also that, like once you're in, like when you're in school, especially like you start out like your day with lectures and whatnot, and then you have SP, so you have clinical skills, and you're in a goal-oriented sort of like mindset, and you have to, everything's like dire, everything's life or death, and you're getting tested on, or at least you feel like you're getting tested on, and that transition, just having like that transition to say, okay, you are in that mindset just because you have to be. That's the way like you gotta like it's a survival sort of like mechanism, right? But you can transition out of that, transition into a place where you like you can just have fun. You can just do things because they're silly, because they make you because they make you laugh, because you think, oh, I don't know, like it's silly. I don't know. It doesn't have to mean anything. It's just I just doing it.
Kind of like freestyling a little bit.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think like the class itself showed me, and I think showed everybody else. Because we had warm up exercises before we actually did into any, like jumped into anything serious, which warm-ups are actually very serious too.
If you don't warm up, you'll pull a muscle, man.
Yeah, no. But ours warm-ups ended up, initially you have games, and then like Craig doesn't one of the games, like he doesn't necessarily tell you the rules, but we being medical students, we put the limits. Like, oh, these are the rules that nobody talks about them, but then everybody's like, oh, I guess we can't do this, we can't do that. But then,
my professor said this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Like, do that thing.
Subconscious, like you're putting rules. Oh, I guess nobody else is doing it, so I guess there's an unsaid rule that we can't do this. And then at the end, Craig will be like, well, I never told you couldn't do any, there's no rules. You just do anything. And at that point, like you start seeing like the more like you go through the course and like as the semester progresses, you're like, oh, like everybody started loosening up. And I think even as it took less time like of warming up to just start getting freeing up. Then eventually it's just with we ended up also doing a playwriting part of it, and we had 2 drafts, and I think like the impressive thing to see was initially when everybody like wrote like the first draft, or at least me personally, when I wrote the first draft, it was very focused on like the story that I was seeing in my mind, and I was kind of just telling me my own story, trying to explain it to me. And and then when you read it out loud and you hear everybody else, it doesn't make sense because you're leaving all things unsaid. And that's where like the idea of like shifting from, okay, you can see things very clearly, but someone else, like your audience, whoever you're trying to convey it to, is not seeing what you're seeing. So how can you switch? How can you shift? Like you need to be, to have clarity, you need to be where you are. You need to see what you're seeing, but now you have to like transfer it over. It's not useful if you're not able to convey it to someone clearly and in a way that they can follow.
Yeah, and the challenge just has to be a lot different than, say, screenwriting or novel writing, because you can't zoom in on anything. It's got to be clear, and you've got to do it for, I'm imagining, for the audience as well as for everyone on stage. Yeah.
Yeah, and that point of clarity is a really interesting turning point for me in terms of how I teach this class. So I've had the benefit of working alongside two really great co-teachers, Kitson O'Neill, who runs Shakespeare in Clark Park and also works at Interact Theater Company, and Elle Feldman, who is a wonderful playwright and clown teacher in town. But when we're doing these rewrites and when we're talking about writing plays, it's twofold. You do want it to be as clear as possible. You want to, how do I put exactly what I want into the page so that when I turn it over to actors, they say it the way I want them to say it, or the plot makes the sort of sense it made when I was writing at 2 a.m. in my room, right? But the other lesson that we are not, we're just kind of springing on people is that moment when you have it read and people start making choices you didn't think about.
Right.
They start responding to things you put in there on a whim or didn't even know you put in there. And so we are also, on the one hand, we are kind of trying to teach how do you clearly communicate an idea by thinking through how an audience hears it, but we're also trying to teach comfort with that ambiguity of having an idea and then setting it loose.
Yeah, that seems like it's got real world practical implications for you discussing with patients and their families, because on one hand, and we talk about this on this show a lot, on your own and with your colleagues, the patient is a science project. And there's a diagnosis, and maybe there's individualism, but there's also pathways and the things that you're obviously, diving into right now. But then you talk to the humanity side, and their families, and they're freaking out, and you're like, well, you should do this thing. Like, yeah, I Googled it, and to get your point across in a way that's empathetic, I can't even imagine the benefit from learning to write as well as to perform that way. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. No, I think you definitely, I don't know, speaking for myself, but also I think almost the whole cohort that I was with, like they definitely seemed like they felt a lot more confident with just trying to talk these things that are like mushy, or you can't, like, there's no delineation for it, but given the time, you don't have to like go in, like maybe like tap with it a little bit and see how comfortable you feel the waters, and then go deeper if you need to or not. And I think that was definitely like, it's the one thing that these kind of programs teach you. You sort of like, improvise in the moment. Just feel it out. Like you have an idea, this is what I'm going to do, but then if it doesn't work out, all right, I can change around. I can change it.
Yeah, there's also a parallel that I think about a lot where we do a play or you write a script, and you can always do another draft. We were talking before we started recording of like, you do a performance, there's always if you're doing it well, right, there's always another performance the next day, and it's always going to be a little bit different, and your lived experience is always going to change as you go forward. So the play never really ends, it's just, it closes and you don't get to do it anymore, right? It's not like quote unquote finished.
You live for the moment, but there's another moment right around the corner.
And so similarly, there is, we talked a lot in these classes, the difference between like quote unquote curing someone and treating a patient.
Right.
And the fact that treating just never really stops, like especially even if it's just making sure someone is healthy and they're coming in for their checkups. But for a lot of illnesses, that's not a thing that you cure. It's a thing that you help someone manage. It's all that kind of stuff. So that is another thing that I've certainly learned is a potential benefit of our program by just talking through it over the years of like, okay, this is an impulse that you want to have. How would you keep improving it if we had more time? How would it change? Think through how it would change if we really put it in the hands of actors and staged it, all that kind of stuff. Similar to, you're going to have patients that you're going to see their entire lives and your entire lives. You're not going to end that relationship and move on. How do you just keep that going?
That's really powerful. So I think we were talking off mic about how some personality traits are the same, and we make jokes with everyone here. Like our first guest was Dr. Lorenzo Norris. He's the dean of the George Washington, student dean, George Washington School of Medicine and Health Sciences, I believe. And he and I spoke about, like, not always true, but if you think about the cliches about surgeons are true, and the cliches about family med are true, and the cliches about psych are true. Right. But are the cliches about the disparities between what a scientist is like trying to act versus what an actor is trying to act.
What's
it been like dealing with people who are, I would suppose, left brain or scientific compared with people who are right brain and would sign up for a theater class at their liberal arts school?
So there's an interesting overlap, because I do think we do have folks who self-select in. So we do get folks who are already kind of interested and already think creatively, or like to think creatively. Not that they've necessarily done theater before. I did, our first or second year, we had someone who did not stick with the class, who I thought was very kind of rigid in their thinking and really would have benefited. But they didn't make it. They were like, I don't have time for this. So there is an overlap there, but I think for me, what's really been interesting to watch is, as Luis was saying earlier, there's a desire to get it right. Where in theater, if you've kind of just come up making theater and making a lot of art that is generative, not necessarily like learning to sing a song, but also like making your own songs, you're used to not being satisfied with it, and you're used to bumps, and you're used to failure. Rehearsal is nothing but 3 weeks of failure before an audience shows up. So to then encounter students who are like, they are in a very competitive med school because they are gotten a lot of things right. And as you said before, Luis, like the stakes during your day-to-day classes feel very high. You don't like failure at all. You would like to avoid it. I would like you to avoid it when you're operating on me. But to then give them an exercise that is deliberately about messing up and deliberately about learning from mistakes and reveling in mistakes, that is usually a hiccup for folks.
I imagine there's no way to win theater. I'm more with Craig because I like you said, I came from a writing school, and they're like, man, the people at this MFA program, these professors who were like, their books are in the library, and they're like, yeah, you're gonna hate it by the time you're done with it. You have no idea. We're like, I just burn this one, just start over. It's all editing. But the stakes for you and I are not necessarily logistically the same. Where if I screw up this podcast, then I have to figure something out. If you screw up a person dies.
Yeah, the stakes different.
And yet your emotional response to it can be similar. So a lot of the way I talk about it when we're in the class is just to say, hey, this is a safe space to fail, so that you can just learn what that feels like, because that's gonna happen. And we've had folks write plays about very powerful moments of mistakes that they've made as professionals. In the first 2 years, we had a couple of professionals or practicing docs and teachers in the course. And some of what they wrote were about cases that still bugged them. And thinking through, one was actually about kind of this sequence of like, okay, I don't want to tell anyone because that might, I misdiagnosed a patient. I don't want to tell anyone because I don't want to be perceived as weak or failing. Okay, but now I'm still thinking about it, so I am not treating this patient effectively. And then that gets pointed out to me. So then my next patient, I freak out and look for everything and freak them out. And this cascading effect of not being able to metabolize failure. And not to say that like everyone's going to mess up big, but just it's a thing that, we were talking earlier, the competitive aspect of theater, like most people go to 10 times as many auditions as they ever get cast in. So actors just kind of cultivate, and I know a lot of them question it. They're like, why am I doing this to myself?
And doctors question it too.
Well, but then we get in the rehearsal room, and most of what we're trying to do is make a bunch of stuff that doesn't work so that we can find the thing that does.
Right.
A big thank you to Craig and Luis. That concludes this episode of the Post Call Podcast. You can catch part 2 of this conversation next week, and you can catch previous episodes of the Post Call Podcast wherever podcasts are found. Thanks for listening. And for MD Edge, I'm Nick Andrews.